Above all, thanks a lot to Gerdian for having me and for all the CODART committee and members. As Martina Griso wrote in 2013, the history of museum storage has still to be written. In her book, Museum Storage in History and Present, she presumes that this history began in the late 19th century, when appropriate storage rooms were designed and built for the first time. That stands to be proven because actually the first modern museums founded in the decades around 1800 did have some structures that can be called storage rooms. In the following minutes, I would like to show you how this question arose in the first place and how curators reacted to it. Some written sources and plans show traces of the early storage design. Traces, I say, because we do not know how exactly the first storage rooms looked like. I have not found any details concerning storage rooms in museums in Paris or London. I have found some hints for museums in Italian cities and in Berlin, but no precise plans or technical details. What we can say is the question of storing works of art in order to protect them from damage, destruction, or deprivation arose often and all over around 1800. At the same time, the storage of objects behind the display space was avoided, or at least only temporary. In the early history of museums, storage rooms seem to have not been planned as such. Indeed, storing works of art was contrary to the very reason museums were founded, bringing hidden collections and treasures to light, making them visible to a public, which itself was in the state of being formed as the modern society, as the citizens, and exhibiting them for the purposes of education, enjoyment, and the object's own good. This was indeed one argument for the foundation of the first Pinakothek, the Royal Gallery and the Luxembourg Palace in Paris. In 1750, a selection of 99 paintings and 20 drawings from the French Royal Collection were put on display in the former royal apartment rooms and in 2 gallery wings. One of these galleries contained the Rubens cycle of the life of Maria de' Medici, which was part of the original palace design. François Blondel, who made also this plan, described the Luxembourg Palace in 1752, shortly after it was opened to the public. And it provided access to some treasures of the Majesty's painting collection, and it appears that all the rooms were accessible. At least they were all mentioned as hosting important works of art that should be visited. The storage itself was in Versailles. As a preparatory report says, and I quote the document from Andrew McLellan's survey from 1994 here, "The king's paintings are so uncomfortably housed in picture cabinets at Versailles that they must be stacked one on top of another, thwarting the curiosity of foreigners and others who desire to see them." End of quote. We clearly see that it was not only the wish to show the artworks to the public that led to the gallery's foundation, but also the need for conservation. The paintings should neither be stored on top of one another, nor should they be moved often to show them to visitors. And even more clearly, the report says shortly afterwards, quote, "And as they will be on display, attention will be given to those in need of restoration." So this was indeed an important point. If the paintings were presented to the public, care would be taken of them. Both arguments, accessibility and protection, were crucial for the massing of artworks in the revolutionary museums from 1792 on. In this year, the Louvre was designed officially to be a depot of paintings, statues, and other objects belonging to the state. The point was to keep the works safe, both from their former owners, such as churches or noblemen or the royal families, and from vandalism by radical revolutionists. The word depot meant a safe place for public property, and it connotes accessibility as well. The nation's treasures should be shown to and used by the public for study and enjoyment. We can find this illustrated in Hubert Robert's series of ideal perspectives of the Grand Gallery at the Louvre. Here we see one version that presumably documents how the gallery was disposed in the first years of the Revolutionary Museum. We see paintings and sculptures on display on the walls and on easels, mostly female visitors, some of them with children, and they seem to be doing more copying or chatting than looking at the objects on the walls. But anyway, they are enjoying and using this museum and this heritage. As I said, this is an ideal view of the museum. In reality, the Musée Central, since 1803 Musée Napoléon, was a construction site during its whole existence. Due to construction work on the building, like the replacing of the windows in 1804, many paintings were not on display, or precisely they stayed where they were, but the gallery room was closed. And if we believe the Prussian writer Karl van Hagen van Ense, they were not even protected from dust and dirt during the work. Damages and robbery were reported, as well as the lack of space and of gallery keepers. Two aspects may have been the most significant ones, for they led to the conception of storage rooms, restoration and fluctuation. So, the writer and artist Hermine van Scheese visited the Louvre very often. She was befriended with many artists and officials who gave her access to pictures that were not on display, which means to rooms that were not open for the public. And if we look here at the plan of the Great Gallery, it is difficult to identify which rooms that could have been. Friedrich Schlegel reported in 1802 that behind the gallery there was a smaller, quote, a smaller room where those paintings are stored that are currently not on display, those which are being worked on, like the Madonna of Foligno and the Transfiguration by Raphael. Here lie, leaned against each other at the wall, the divine masterworks of Perugine and the sweet Giovanni Bellino, unseen and unadored, end of quote. This storage and restoration room was probably not in the Tuileries castle that would be here on the left, nor one of the other museum rooms that we see here on the right, but it was most likely part of the Grand Gallery itself that must have been divided by temporary wall. So first, the picture we just saw, Hubert Robert, was like a view from here towards here. And you see how long this gallery is. So I expect that here must have been some kind of division, but I'm not sure, I don't know. And probably there will be people in Paris who know it better than me, but that's what I can suggest. This storage was seen also by Hermine van Scheese, who saw a lot of paintings in this Restaurierungssaal, as she says, and I quote, "However, only to some of the most important ones I could dedicate a closer and repeated observation. And even some of the most exquisite ones have very quickly been removed from my gaze." After having spoken about some paintings by Leonardo da Vinci and his scholars, Scheese continues, quote, some more paintings of Leonardo are resting in the archive of the restoration room. They will be doubtlessly displayed in some years when there will be room and time. So this quoted archive might have meant some shelves or cabinets, if not the room itself. Anyway, Scheese's observation makes clear that storage was intended to be temporary. The first inventory of the artworks that were kept in the Musée Napoléon was not conducted until 1810, upon demand of the Minister of the Interior, Pierre Deroux. The Louvre director, Dominique Vivant-Denon, explained that the difficulty of writing this inventory was due to the high fluctuation of works as they entered and left the museum, among other factors. Already in 1802, Schlegel provided an explanation for what happened to at least some of the works in storage, claiming that, quote, a great number of good and famous pictures have been removed. People say that they are intended to embellish the palaces of the Tuileries and Saint-Cloud. While Denon assured the minister in 1810 that every movement of any object was documented, Schlegel had already in 1802 written that it was impossible, quote, to have a complete overview on everything here and to keep it in view, end of quote. And this was even before the war campaigns in Flanders, Germany, and Italy, during which time the museum was flooded with even more objects. In 1801, already, the Louvre contained about almost 3,000 paintings, 20,000 drawings, 30,000 prints, and 150 antiques. The official report says that 6,700 paintings existed in the storage spaces of the Louvre, waiting for a place that could assume them, or they're waiting for restoration. In Verona, for example, the French seized a lot of paintings by Andrea Mantegna. We see here an extract of this inventory from 1810, listing the parts of the San Zeno altarpiece. I've chosen it because they are classified as placed in the Musée Napoleon, but it is not specified where. In fact, Hermine von Schiesi also mentioned that these paintings were in the possession of the Musée Napoleon, as we see it here, but not on display. And not even that, some of them were already brought out of Paris to the Provincial Museum of Tours shortly after 1803. In the inventory, at the border of the page, there is just a note, remis à Monsieur Rosa. If we look at the whole altarpiece, we realize that the original frame had been left in Verona and that its several parts have been dismantled and dispersed. The three main parts were stored in the Louvre and were given back after 1815. Two of the three pedella pieces were sent to Tours, where they are still today, and the crucifixion remained in the Louvre too. If we switch back to the inventory, we see the original inventory number only for the crucifixion and the note Galerie, which was all added later, so after 1815. The report from 1801 mentioned above was also intended to announce the distribution of artworks from the storage to museums in the provinces, where they should be displayed. This political order was given to spread revolutionary benefit, but it caused a lot of critique too. Schlegel regretted the shipment to the provinces where the artworks would, quote, hardly be ever seen again by the eye of an art lover, which is also worth to be discussed a lot. Indeed, some of the objects went missing, were stored or even sold in the destination towns. However, most artworks were put on display, as, for example, in Mainz, where a set of 36 paintings that came from Paris, from the Louvre, were arranged in a secularized monastery, which was gallery and storage at the same time in 1809. This example is only one of many storage complexes, like there were in Italy. Many more of them existed actually in Italy, where the art academies were responsible for storing artworks in public buildings. Altarpieces from secularized churches and convents, town halls or bishops' palaces. All over the Napoleonic Italian states, there were depositi demaniali, from small churches or chapels in provincial towns to vast complexes like the Scuola di San Giovanni in Venice, or, as we see here, the San Marco Monastery in Florence. All these storage units were meant to be temporary too. They were usually not accessible, only on demand and presumably with credentials. For example, in 1827, the Baron Karl Friedrich von Rumor, who was an art critic and collector, was allowed by the city of Florence to visit the storages of the Academy, that is, the former convent of San Marco. The Florentine Academy had ambitious ideas for this complex. The convent of San Marco, with its famous fresco paintings by Fra Angelico and Fra Bartolomeo, was to be basically used as a storage for less important paintings, pitture di minor pregio, and other objects on behalf of the Academy. Its president, writing to the local authorities of the French government, proposed to enlarge the complex, transforming it into a real study center, with the possibility to study on the ground floor and to live and work in ateliers on the upper floor. Trying to make public collections fully accessible and usable to amateurs, scholars, and other visitors was not limited to the revolutionary or Napoleonic program. Laws were set still by the Austrian government after 1815 to prohibit the permanent storage or sale of public goods, apart from exceptional cases of deterioration or grave circumstances. The problem was the sheer number of objects in question. In Venice, there were in fact several auctions held between 1810 and 1824, selling thousands of paintings from the depositi. And still in 1837, the central storage in the Palazzo Ducale contained more than 1,500 pictures. Around 1820, the Brera Academy and Gallery in Milan had in storage 140 out of 650 works, 28 were in the restoration room, 63 in the gallery keeper's room, and 28 in the room of the musician Banfi, whoever that was. That means 40% of the inventoried pictures were not on display. And in Vienna itself, the Royal Galleries had even more of its treasures in storage, 2,200 out of 3,500. One of the few visualizations of storage rooms is this etching by Swedish artist Johan Fredrik Martin, showing a room of the San Birgitta monastery in Vadstena. The picturesque arrangement makes it difficult to believe that it represents a documentary view. The disposition oscillates between treasure chamber and lumber room, and it was not a museum, really, this monastery at that time. But here we realize an important aspect of what modern storage is. The storage facility needs not only to have room for the works themselves, but also the adequate false work, shelves, lockers, boards, etc. We remember Shesi talking about the archive of the restoration room, which may have referred to such structures. And Martina Grieser considers special furniture of storing, protecting, and sorting objects as predecessors of modern museum storages. In fact, at the turn of the 18th-19th century, structural order and protection measures for the objects had not yet been developed for the spaces behind the scenes. Nonetheless, protection was the crucial purpose of storage. Where the Louvre contained works of art that were considered undoubted treasures, the Musée des Monuments Français, founded and led by Alexandre Lenoir in a former monastery in Paris, the Petits Augustins, contained objects that had literally been saved from vandalism, destruction, or neglect. We see here the whole structure of the museum, containing the presentation and period rooms in the convent, bottom right, and the courtyard in the middle, and in the garden, its upper left. And like in Vadstena, the storage room seems to be in disorder, but in fact it is arranged to be part of the exposition itself. If we take a closer look at the floor plan, we notice that beside the exhibition spaces, there were a few spaces that could have served as storage rooms, like here right above this room of the 13th century. And we can assume that most of the objects must have been visible to the visitors. So this is the look into the rooms. And here we see in this arrangement that, always considering that these images are not documentary, it is obvious that the number of objects kept and shown in these rooms must have been quite limited, as the general plan has already implied. In the museum's early years, the rooms must have been much more crowded, wherein the Petits Augustins were dedicated to the nation as a storage space for objects of art. This is the catalogues, the first catalogues, and we see also the very first one includes the word temporary, which has been cancelled out 2 years later. So the catalogues count many objects that were obviously not arranged for display, but they do not tell us where they were actually stored or located. The vast complex was continuously transformed from a mere storage place to a didactic exhibition space. So the plan we have just seen was also already kind of memorial to this museum, which was in permanent transformation. And this depot was, in fact, really open. It was more or less both. And depot was, we see it again, above all, a synonym for a safe place on public property, which implicitly included its accessibility to the public. We know that Lenoir fought with the authorities and with the Louvre keepers to be allowed to open this depot really to the public and to keep it open. His fear was that it could be used just as a reservoir for the Musée Central or other state officials that could dissolve it more easily if it was hidden and closed. Most of the new public collections had to be implemented in existing buildings, and we now will have a look at some newly constructed museums to learn if and how storage became an issue there. First, a short look at the very early history of London's National Gallery. In England, as we can often read in the sources, many exquisite yet not easily accessible art collections were hidden on private property and spread all over the country. Even if this claim was too polemical to be true, it was one of the driving reasons for founding a National Gallery. And this founding was realized in 1824 when Parliament decided to acquire the diplomat and merchant John Julius Angustine's painting collection, including his house. By purchasing this collection, the Parliament created a public and representative collection of masterpieces. And that means that the question of storage cannot have been important, as the collection was only to consist of relatively few objects of high quality that were all supposed to be displayed. And we can see it in this picture in which the collection is displayed like a nobleman's gallery, which it actually was at the beginning. However, for our purpose, it is interesting to see how fast even an exclusive and small collection that expanded very slowly nevertheless required more and more space. Complaints about the lack of space had been reported since the founding of the National Gallery, and the expected growth and the urge to show every single picture may have been the main reason for planning a new building. The plans were concentrated on the exhibition rooms anyway, while storage space seems not to have been explicitly planned. However, in the cross-section of Wilkin's project that was realized in the 1830s, we identify at least 2 floors on bottom left that may have, at least in part, been intended as storage spaces. So in the basement, I think it's these 2, you see, this is the basement floor and first floor, and this is the gallery space. And these 2 parts of the building may at least have given some room. How can we explain the fact that storage seems not to have been considered at all in the planning of the museums, even in places like in Paris, Milan, or Berlin, where museum collections from the beginning contained so many objects that could never be all put on display? In Berlin, for instance, about 1/3 of the picture gallery of the Royal Museum, which was planned and built after the Napoleonic Wars, was supplied by the Royal Prussian art collections taken from the various castles. In 1828, when the selection for the future museum was organized, the future gallery director Gustav Friedrich Wagen wrote, "Yesterday and today I have cobbed about 30 paintings with not little effort out of 1,200 pictures that are in storage in the castle, standing there packed one on the other." And when Wagen did this, more than 1,000 more paintings that had been acquired already for the museum had already been sorted out. So even more were to follow then until the museum opened its doors to the visitors 2 years later. We see some lists of pictures here that had been magazineered, stored between 1823 and 1830. Some of them were expected to be given to the royal castles in exchange for their contributions to the museum. However, that was only a relatively small part. Indeed, beside the establishment and refurnishing of the museum and the castles, we see above all a massive exchange of storage objects, fluctuation. During preparation of the future museum, about 1,200 paintings that were intended for display were kept in the side rooms of the Art Academy. 700 that were intended for storage, were kept in the university building, including some for possibly exchanges with other museums, and more than 1,000 paintings more were stored in an empty noble palace, waiting to be auctioned, although no action ever did take place. So there was thousands of paintings to be stored, and we wonder where did they do that when they built this new museum. And when we look at the floor plan of this new museum, of the picture gallery, we realize how fully packed it was, even without checking the catalogue, which had more than 1,200 entries. The rooms were divided into cabinets, which were dedicated to the various schools, and which contained up to 40 paintings each. 2 separate rooms, here in green, were part of the gallery, but had only limited access. These compartments were dedicated to the curiosities of art history, a study gallery for visitors particularly interested in medieval and early Renaissance paintings. And finally, we see 2 extra rooms that were, as Schinkel wrote in 1824, planned for storage and restoration. It's in red. These rooms are 29 by 17 feet each, which is about 9 by 5 meters. Considering that the basement was too wet to store paintings and that the ground floor did not provide any room for it, these small chambers must have been the Magazinräume for some 100 paintings that did not make it into the gallery. Many of them were then distributed, just like the Louvre had done some decades before, to various provincial museums also churches, I quote, where these paintings will have a highly beneficial effect while they would remain unnoticed here and fill the storage rooms, said the director. According to Willem von Bode later, the narrow corridors aside the rotunda were also more and more filled with discarded paintings, quote, hung up and set up as well and as badly as it was possible. So in these corridors here. And even in its schematic design, the cross-section that we see here on the left shows that the gallery is filled as much as possible. A real storage was not planned for, at least not for all the paintings that had been left over. Willem van Bode claims too, many decades later, that he would have climbed up to the space under the roof, that would be this part here, finding there about 1,000 paintings, Renaissance panels, canvases, without frames and stretchers, deteriorated by humidity, heat and dust in the decades before. And if we believe him, this was actually the final storage for the less valued objects. Let me sum up our observations. At the beginning, we saw how Enlightenment and Revolution caused the wish and the claim to give access to hidden collections or works for education, for studies, and for enjoyment. And this aim represented indeed the opposite of storage. Early museums had 4 solutions for the increasing number of objects in their possession. First, they tried to display as much as possible in galleries or open storage rooms, or to extend the exhibition space. Second, they distributed the surplus to provincial museums, to churches, public houses, etc. Third, keepers tried to exchange, or fourth, to sell the objects that were not desired to be kept. Storage was only intended on a temporary basis and was not explicitly planned for or furnished. Nonetheless, there was another idea that grew in the decades around 1800. The awareness that works of art and other objects too belonged to a heritage that needed protection. The responsibility was soon given to the newly created museum structures, and they were to keep the objects not only accessible but safe. Consequently, museums had to face the necessity of storing these objects as custodians. The Louvre was not the only place where this happened, but it surely was one of the most significant examples. Its swiftly expanding collection and fluctuation did not only provoke admiration. The archaeologist and writer Antoine Quatremer de Quincy criticized museums as uprooting graves for artworks that would lose their meanings and their value by being collected, put in order, and stored. And as the Montaigne example has shown to us, this uprooting actually happened, or could happen. And although this refusal did not reflect the majority of public opinion, the hidden storage of artworks therefore appeared like something unseemly, something that had to be avoided. But storage and the sense of keeping cultural heritage in a safe place for public interest, that was an important point which led to modern museum storages. And as Helmina von Chesi put it in 1804, I quote, "Good Paris, as big as it is, does not know yet where to find the space for the riches that the grace of the God of victory has given to it. There is no worthy place for such treasures, and there cannot be any within short time. It is like the works of art lived in rented accommodation until their real temples will arise one day." Thank you.